in India as heavy rains cause dangerous mudslides. MPs debate imposing a windfall tax on profits from oil and gas production. And New Mexico battles its biggest ever wildfire as experts say the risk to some populated areas of America could double. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes and report on the race for solutions. Now, South Asia's battle with the effects of climate change is reaching crisis levels. After weeks of intense heat waves, at least 11 people have now died in flooding and mudslides triggered by heavy rains in the northeast of India. And experts say that climate change is making these events much more common. Well, the northeastern states of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam are the latest areas to be badly affected by the extreme weather, with heavy rain causing flooding and mudslides. It follows weeks of record-breaking high temperatures, which are persisting. On Sunday, temperatures hit 49 degrees in the capital, Delhi. That's the highest ever recorded for May. And then over the weekend, temperatures soared over 45 degrees in several areas, including Rajasthan, Punjab and Uttar Pradesh. Well, scientists say that landslides are becoming more frequent in the north of India as global warming contributes to the melting of glaciers. In Assam, at least 200,000 people were cut off as roads and bridges became blocked or washed away. And the army was called in to help with the rescue effort there. And the extreme temperatures are affecting supplies of wheat, a much sought-after commodity at the moment amid global shortages of the crop. India is limiting exports of the grain in an attempt to keep domestic prices from rising. Well, our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook, is here. So, Victoria, the extreme weather having a real impact on food supplies in India, and that's part of a wider issue of food security, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So Russia and Ukraine together, to take wheat for an example, they produce a quarter of the world's wheat exports. Now, that's obviously been terribly disrupted with the war in Ukraine. India produces even more wheat than Russia, and there had been some hopes that India could perhaps step in and plug some of that shortfall. But now that's all changed with this extreme weather. They are severely limiting their exports. And this is all hitting quite hard because food prices, they were already squeezed even before the war in Ukraine, so energy costs were going up, and of course that affects the cost of transporting food that needs to be shipped all over. And fertiliser costs were going up too. Fertiliser is made from gas. So this is an example of how all of these crises kind of intersect. So we've got climate, conflict, food and energy. Having said that, the better news in all of this, I suppose, is that some of the solutions also intersect and overlap. So, for example, cutting down use of fertiliser helps to cut emissions. It also cuts costs, and it can be very good for soils. Cutting food waste also cuts emissions and helps with costs.
Victoria, thanks very much indeed. Now, it's estimated that 28 million more people than in 2021 are now at high risk from extreme heat because they lack access to cooling. A report by Sustainable Energy for All finds that people's ability to survive these increasingly frequent extreme weather events is under threat. Well, let's get more on this. Joining us now is Brian Dean, who's Head of Energy Efficiency and Cooling at Sustainable Energy for All. So welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. So how great are the risks then of extreme heat, and who's the most vulnerable?
Yeah, these risks are actually continuing to grow, as you showed with the extreme heat in India right now. These are situations that are affecting mostly those that don't have access to electricity, those that are in extreme poverty. And we find that there's 1.2 billion people around the world that are in this situation of being really at high risk without lack of access to cooling. That's the inability to pay for cooling, the inability to have community services that provide cooling during heat waves. This is affecting rural poor, including those rural farmers that are delivering these products to us, this food around the world. But it's also from a health perspective, when you don't have a healthcare facility that has access to electricity in these rural regions, they're also at significant risk, both from the health impact of receiving medical care, but also, of course, the vaccines, which we know are so important after this pandemic. So those are the major, 1.2 billion.
Apologies for interrupting. I was just going to ask what can be done about it then. Is this all down to getting cooling systems in place? It's all down to air conditioning and refrigeration?
No, it's a much more complex situation. Obviously, having access to the ability to afford an air conditioner and refrigeration, that's great for the middle income, the upper income populations. But when you're talking about those that are in extreme poverty and those that don't have access to electricity, there are additional solutions that are needed. A heat action plan for the city, those 800 million people in urban that are lacking access to cooling, those cities need to have the services in place. The warnings in place for extreme heat waves and the community cooling facilities. And for, we've found that if people get access to electricity and those that are just pulled out of extreme poverty, those two fundamental issues will pull 440 million people out of this high-risk category by 2030. And we're certainly looking to push further than that to actually have those efficient solutions as well, which would pull many more people out of this high-risk category and even medium-risk categories.
Brian Dean, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
MPs have voted down a Labour amendment to the Queen's speech in favour of a windfall tax on oil and gas producers. But the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, did say that no option is off the table if energy companies don't reinvest their profits soon. Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins us now from Westminster. John.
No option is off the table, says Rishi Sunak, in what is a pretty thinly veiled threat to the oil companies, that he is prepared to bring in a windfall tax, as demanded by Labour and a small handful of Conservative MPs, if they don't invest in cheaper energy and energy security. Now, during day 5 of the Commons debate on the Queen's speech, Mr Sunak talked about energy companies who've made extraordinary profits at a time of acutely elevated prices. And they have to, he says, invest those profits back into British jobs, growth and energy security. But in his threat to them, he said, if that doesn't happen, and soon, and at significant scale, no option is off the table. Well as a tax on the oil and gas companies by opposition MPs, there was some pretty strong language used by some Tory backbenchers. Robert Halfon, the ex-minister who's a big fuel price campaigner, said that the oil bosses were the new oligarchs. He said they were earning multi-million-pound salaries, multi-million-pound bonuses. And he urged the Chancellor to consider a windfall tax on the oil companies, to cut taxes for the lower paid or cut energy bills. Also backing that call was Mel Stride, the MP who chairs the Treasury Select Committee.
Now for some of the day's other climate news. And there's a warning today that fossil fuel production sites need to be shut down sooner to limit global warming to a rise of 1.5 degrees, a goal agreed by hundreds of countries around the world. The research published in the journal Environment Research Letters analysed 25,000 oil and gas fields and found that 40% of fossil fuels already developed mustn't be extracted for there to be a 50-50 chance of limiting the increase in the world's temperature. Iraq and Iran have been hit by severe sandstorms, with schools and government offices across both countries being forced to close. Both countries have been hammered by a series of sandstorms since April, grounding flights and leaving thousands with breathing difficulties. Experts blame desertification, low water levels and climate change for the frequency and intensity of the recent storms. Scotland's largest ultra-rapid charging station for electric vehicles has opened today in South Lanarkshire. The station's 8 chargers, each of which is supplied by 100% renewable energy, are capable of adding up to 300 miles of range to fully electric cars in 20 minutes. The electric car hub, operated by Fastned, was partially funded by the Scottish Government as part of its strategy to phase out the country's need for new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Climate change is set to cause a steep increase in the exposure of properties to wildfire risks in America over the next 30 years, according to a new report. It comes as New Mexico battles the largest ever blaze in its history.
These are our coastal winds that we experience generally every day. The big difference is, and we're seeing it again, with the climate change, the fuels beds in this county, throughout Southern California, throughout the West, are so dry that fire like this is going to be more commonplace.
Coming up next on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by the Chief Executive of the Climate Group, Helen Clarkson, and Professor of Global Climate Change Science, Simon Lewis. And we're going to be discussing that report that says that new and some existing oil projects need to stop for temperature rises to be limited to 1.5 degrees. And what do we do about extreme temperatures?
And it's moving this way.
And over there is Dover.
We track the changes happening to our world right now.
I think it's a procession of the Taliban. There they are, right here.
Would you, as Prime Minister, be able to look them in the face?
Let's have a look at both of those two things.
I just want to say thank you for having the courage to speak to us.
We do genuinely believe in what we do, to show the truth.
I thought there was an astonishing story there.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Chief Executive of the Climate Group, Helen Clarkson, and Simon Lewis, a Professor of Global Climate Change Science. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So first of all, a study today suggests that nearly half of existing fossil fuel facilities will need to close down early if global warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. Now, that's a marked step up in language that we heard last year from the International Energy Agency, who said there should be no new investment in coal, oil or gas if the targets were to be reached. So, Helen, there were actually raised eyebrows from some when the IEA put out its report last year. And this one goes further. And the reason they say they go further is because they're saying that we can't rely on technology to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Are they right, do you think, to rule that out? Couldn't that technology make a big difference?
Yeah, I think they are right. And I think this is a real wake-up call to the oil and gas industry, who we've seen really drag their feet and, you know, put a lot of eggs in the basket of, oh, we'll get technology in the future which will remove carbon and it will be all right. But that technology is not getting to scale at the pace it would need to keep removing fossil fuels from the ground at the pace that we're going. So it was very good to see the IEA come out with that last year. I think a lot of us thought that's good, but it isn't quite far enough. And I think this report, we've got to get the message through that we need to leave oil and gas and coal in the ground, and that the business model that the oil and gas companies think is there, it isn't there. We've got to make a much more rapid transition to renewable technology.
But Simon, this is a tough ask, isn't it, for oil and gas companies when they've got projects already running or they're already in the pipeline. I mean, how do you incentivise them to halt projects when there's a lot of money at stake and there's also people's jobs and people's livelihoods?
Yes, but they've had 30 years of warnings that this transition is required and is required fast. And what the fossil fuel industry has done is pumped money into lobbying, into portraying climate science as a myth science, and doing everything they can to delay and delay and delay the final reckoning. And what we're seeing with all these heat waves around the world is that climate impacts are real and they are deadly serious and they are destabilizing to society. We need to get out of them very fast. And there's a bunch of things that can be done. For one, the UK government and other governments in the global north could stop giving out new licenses for new extraction of oil fields, such as in the North Sea. And in COP26, there was a very positive development in that the UK, US, and EU got together and put together an $8.5 billion fund for a just transition for South Africa to close their coal mines early and the coal production and move that society towards clean, green energy and jobs for the future. And that model is already being talked about in terms of Indonesia and India, and those are models that we can get forward with. But the UK and the US and Norway and other oil producers need to play their part as well as the global south getting out of coal.
Well, yes, and Helen, I mean, to what extent do you think this is down to government intervention and regulation? And to what extent can the market play a role? I mean, are oil companies increasingly seeing that in future their profits are going to be made in cleaner energy?
They sort of say that they are, but there's a kind of effect that I sort of call it one last coal mine, where every government or company is like, look at our green targets, look at what good we're going to do in the future. We'll just build one more coal mine and then we'll get on with it. And I think what we need is a much more rapid shift and an understanding you don't get one more. We've got to make this transition now. And so the shift we've seen from the oil and gas companies is kind of paying a lip service to it. It's a start, recognizing there's a problem. But as Simon says, we've seen so much money going into lobbying on the other side. You see them lobbying governments to hold up the subsidies they get. There's still fossil subsidies going to fossil fuel companies. And we're seeing now they're making record profits. We need to level the playing field. We need to see those same types of subsidies going to renewable energies. We have the technology now to solve this. We don't need to wait for carbon capture technologies in the future. We will need those for things like cement and steel. But on the energy system, we have the solutions now. We need to stop the companies and others that are blocking us from making that transition.
And very briefly, Simon, you touched on this a bit before, but, you know, the UK may have issues, but they're dwarfed, aren't they, by some of the countries you mentioned, Indonesia, for example, Poland, India, countries that need fossil fuels at the moment to keep the lights on.
Well, UK is not a large emitter globally, but then few countries are large emitters globally because there are 200 countries. And that's an excuse for not taking the action. It's like that point about, you know, one last coal mine. Oh, we're just not enough of an important player. The UK was the leader of the Industrial Revolution, and it needs to lead to get beyond that and go to clean, green sources of energy that are not only better for the planet, they're better for all of us, our health and prosperity going forward. I think in 2022, an investment in fossil fuels is an investment against human progress. And we should remember that as we go forward.
OK, I'm going to go forward now, if that's OK. We're going to need to crack on with our next subject because India and Pakistan are gasping under record temperatures. Many parts of the South Asia have suffered a heat wave since March. It's the hottest March in over 120 years. So, Simon, this is a region that's no stranger to high temperatures and hot weather, is it? But how do you think this is different? And is this about climate change?
Oh, it's certainly about climate change. The increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere mean that there's a greater probability of these heat waves happening and for them happening for longer. So this is what is expected from the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere. And what's really, really alarming about these heat waves is that they're getting to the temperatures that it's very, very difficult to live in and work in and be productive in. And in Gujarat, in this heat wave, we've seen birds falling out of the sky. And we've also seen a big impact on wheat production. So India is the second largest producer of wheat in the world. And it was expecting to export a lot of wheat and take advantage of high prices given the Ukraine war. But now it's just announced that it's going to stop exporting any wheat because of the impact of these climate-related heat waves on its agricultural production. It's a really deadly, serious problem.
Helen, it is. It's got so many implications, doesn't it? Not just the kind of unbearable nature of trying to go about your work in those kind of temperatures, but what can be done about it? I mean, there are various modes of adaptation, aren't there, that can alleviate the issue for some people at least?
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about adaptation and resilience, and I think that is getting more traction. I do, and I know we've sort of divided the topics. I also sort of think we need to not treat them too much as separate topics because, as Simon said, this is about the climate change that's already, you know, baked in due to the historic emissions. We've got to see this as like the start of something that will continue to get worse if we don't mitigate. So I think we need to remember that we've got to keep on mitigating. We've got to keep our eye on sort of every 0.1 degree C of climate change. I think what can confuse people is we talk about 1.5 degrees C of warming, and it doesn't sound maybe that much. But what we know is that that's the average warming, and that leads to these extremes that you see in India. And we're seeing this real human cost to people's lives, their livelihoods. And we saw that the IPCC report, which looked at what are the impacts of 1.5 degrees C of warming, predicted just this sort of impact. And so I think it's a wake-up call on the mitigation side as well as adaptation. As you say, we need to start thinking about how do you make societies resilient? How do you tackle infrastructure issues? How do you think about heat at the equator, you know, cooling elsewhere, and so on? So I think it's really important to think about all these aspects of the climate crisis.
And when we're focusing, Simon, on the adaptation side of that, what can be done? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier with a guest who talked about, you know, refrigeration and air conditioning, but it's much more than that as well, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, we should say that places like India that have had these heat waves in the past and really suffered now have emergency plans to deal with heat waves in the very short term about how to get vulnerable people to places of safety out of the heat. So there are short-term adaptation plans which can reduce the mortality, can reduce the deaths associated with these extreme heat waves. And then over the longer term, then people have to adapt in terms of their housing and heating and cooling, particularly installation of air conditioning, particularly in places like hospitals where there are vulnerable people. And then we need to keep going back to the problem of food production and making major investments to make our agriculture as resilient as possible to keep the food production coming, because we should remember that 1% increase in food prices translates into 10 million more people living in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank.
Wow, that's quite
so as we see food prices going...
Apologies to cut you off, we're out of time. I'm afraid we're going to leave it on that rather stark statistic that you gave us, but we're out of time. Simon and Helen, always good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Well, do stay with us. Coming up next here on Sky News, Trevor Phillips and his guests debate whether we should end the war on junk food to help ease the cost of living crisis. That's on Common Ground, coming up next. And that's it from me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.